So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. Just to let everyone know that we will be recording the session and it will be shortly available on our YouTube channel. We just wanted to highlight this is a joint event between AngelmanUK and FAST UK. We have Louise Prince and Tam Kior, who are FAST UK trustees, join us today as well. And we also have new science and research officer Chelsea Hanlon for AngelmanUK joining us today. We want to, first of all, thank you all for carving out time in your busy schedules to learn a bit more about the clinical trials and the drug approval in the UK. I think the background to this session is pretty much that we expect more and more clinical trial coming to the UK and also some kind of therapeutic to be available in the future in the world at some point. So we want to make sure that you as our community are prepared and all the families are prepared for this. For the information as well, earlier this year we hosted another webinar with Jennifer Panagoulias from FAST on the key considerations about the clinical trials for parents. So you can check it out at our YouTube channel as well. Have a look, maybe that would be useful for you as well. This session is first in series, and we will work to have many more next year with specialists from other charities, the regulator, and people like Dr. Elin Haf Davies today with wealth of industry experience. Thank you so much, Dr. Elin Haf Davies, for joining us tonight. A little bit of the your background and for everyone to share. So Dr. Elin Haf Davies founded Aparito in 2014 on the back of her 21 years of clinical work. She worked as a senior clinical research nurse and a trial administrator at the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. She also did PhD at the University College of London in the UK. And in addition to that, she has a regulatory experience as a scientific assessor at both Medicines Health Regulatory Authority, MHRA, and the European Medicine Agency, EMA. And Aparito was founded as a tech solution to contribute to patient empowerment in the drug development and transform the way the clinical studies are conducted. And at this note, I will hand over to Dr. Davies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be with you here this evening. And just to give you maybe a little bit of an informal introduction to clinical trials and drug approvals here in the UK. You've probably guessed by my name, I am Welsh, but I just want to maybe reassure you at the beginning of the conversation that I may be using acronyms or words that may not be familiar to you. I will try my best not to use any acronyms, but if I do use any, please do write in the chat what are you talking about, and I'll do my best to explain as we go. When you get sort of more and more familiar with clinical trials, you will learn more new words, but try not to be sort of too put off by them. And as I say, please put in chat if I'm mentioning anything that you're not understanding what I'm saying. So I just want to give the context of why do we have clinical trials? And as many of you may know, and certainly as my background from working with children and family at Great Ormond Street Hospital, a treatment for a disease or disorder often brings hope, but it is actually really difficult for that medicine to deliver on the hope that it sort of promises, unless it is easily available for patients and family. So that means having it prescribed by your local GP or by your specialist doctor. If it's adaptable, which means can the dose be adjustable to the size of your child or the needs of your child? Is it appropriate? So is it a medicine that can be swallowed? Is it really difficult for children is it in a liquid formulation? Does it require intravenous infusion? And particularly from the world that we're living in now, is it affordable? So is it something that the NHS can afford? And is it accessible? And these are sort of the concept that we are trying to work towards in developing a new treatment. So how do medicine become available for patients? Well, unfortunately, it is a particularly long and expensive journey, which usually starts in the labs. So there will be a lot of what we call basic research or discovery and preclinical. So this is when the scientists work in the lab to look at different chemistry or mechanism of actions in the development of it. Um, I do want to reassure families that there is an extensive amount of basic research, discovery, and preclinical work that's done before new medicines are allowed to be tried in clinical trials, so introduced into human beings. And currently, we still do some testing on animals, although it's in a very safe and ethical way. We would try and make sure that we understand as much as possible about the safety of those clinical trials. When the regulators are happy that we know as much as we can, we then move into these phases of clinical trials. So the phase 1 is considered the absolute first time that that medicine is given to a human being. So in some instances, this would usually mean recruiting healthy volunteers, very often young men, that are being paid to be admitted into hospital and be given the medicine for the first time. If the mechanism of action is more like a gene therapy, it would not be appropriate to administer that to a healthy volunteer. And therefore, sometimes on those mechanisms of action, we would be administering that first in human directly into patients living with the disease. The purpose of that phase 1 is really to look at the safety of it and to understand a little bit of what happens to that medicine once it's put into the body, either through swallowing a tablet or intravenous or whichever other way. Once that's established in terms of some of the early parameters, we then go what we call phase 2. Now, this means that there'll be a few more people recruited, and we'll be looking at what we essentially mean as pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So pharmacokinetics means how does the body move around the body? How does the medicine, pardon me, move around the body? So how does the liver respond to it? How does the kidneys respond to it? How long does it stay in the body before it gets passed out through either your urine or through sweat? And that's really important to understand how long it stays in the body so that we know what dose to give patients, but also how frequently we may need to give that medicine. So is it a once a day? Is it 3 times a day? And that's why that part of the phase 2 is important to look at dosing, and we're looking at what's considered to be a pharmacodynamic. So what can we measure that it's changing in the body through taking blood samples or again measuring urine. And sometimes in a neurological disorder we'd also be taking cerebrospinal fluid, so that's a little bit of the fluid that goes around the brain and in the spinal cord. Once we then know the dose and how much to give, we move into what we call the phase 3. And this is the most important one in terms of demonstrating efficacy. Does the medicine work? So this will be an even larger patient group. It will have quite a tight inclusion criteria, and I'll go into that a bit more. And it will essentially be looking at, does the medicine give the treatment benefit that we wanted it to do? Once we know the results of that phase 3, and sometimes there'll be a requirement to do more than one of these studies, the sponsor, which is usually a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, will then go and have a regulatory approval. So that will give them a license to sell that medicine under tight specification of who they're allowed to sell it to. But unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will get reimbursed. So we still have a step to justify how much to pay for it, and then it becomes available. And as I mentioned, the phase 3 for the Angelman community, I think will be the phase that you would most likely be asked to participate as new studies start to happen and enroll here in the UK. There are different types of clinical trials. So the traditional type of clinical trial is the one that you would be expected to travel to the hospital for all your assessments. So that means that you'll have a doctor that would usually be called a principal investigator, and they would be responsible for your overall care while you're in the clinical trial. And they will be the one that will be working through you in terms of asking any questions that you may have, understanding how the medicine should work. But the critical thing is that all of it would be done within the hospital. So it's something that will be important for you to consider in terms of where the hospital is and the frequency that you have to travel to that hospital. A hybrid trial means that it would be a combination of doing some of the assessments in the hospital, but you would be asked to do some of the assessments at home. And that's usually to try and balance how much time that you need to spend in the hospital. And then as an opposite one is a decentralized clinical trials. These are not very mainstream at the moment. Obviously, during COVID, they were sort of an enforced aspect because hospitals couldn't support for patients to come in. But on the whole, they're not the most common, especially if they're pediatric children involving. So you're more likely to be asked to take part in a traditional clinical trial where you will be expected to travel into the hospital at either monthly or 3-monthly frequency, or there could be a hybrid trial where you'll be asked to do some things in hospital and some things in the home environment. But in reality, I want to sort of try and explain that it is quite a complex landscape, and there are many hurdles that sometimes you do some research and you come across new data that actually means you have to go back. So although we like to think of it as a straight line, unfortunately, there are certain aspects that happens that you sometimes have to go back and do other research before you can move forward in a straight line. So regulators, are they friends or foe? And I think it's really important to sort of try and understand the role of the regulator, because on the one hand, they can often be portrayed as the bad person that delays progress, makes things slow and bureaucratic, and make it difficult for sponsors and principal investigators, so doctors in your hospital, to bring clinical trials to you. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to appreciate their role, and their role is always to protect the safety and well-being of any patient or any citizen that will be not only asked to take part in clinical trial, but will then eventually get prescribed those medicines when they are demonstrated to be safe and effective. So while it may seem like lots of time, lots of steps, lots of sort of tedious approvals, I would like to kind of convey that they really here are, and their role is not to be difficult, but just to make sure that there are good safety nets in place, so that there are no side effects or toxic response to some of the medicines that are given to patients. Now, here in the UK, the name of our regulator body is the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, often called the MHRA. And prior to Brexit, the MHRA used to work very, very closely with the European Medicine Agency, and every single member state, so every country in Europe, have their own national competent authority. And they would sort of work closely together so that if one medicine was to be approved in one country, like Germany or Spain, then it would mean that that approval would then make it possible for it to be available in all the European member states. As a result of Brexit, that doesn't work anymore, which means that a pharmaceutical company or a biotech will need to go to both the MHRA and the European Medicine Agency, or the individual member states. And that may cause some challenges in how quickly these medicines become accessible in the UK. and which countries they choose for the clinical trials in the first place, and then to sort of launch it in Europe after. So as you follow the progress of clinical trials and you're trying to understand, well, why is that clinical trial available in that country, or why is that medicine being prescribed and licensed in some countries? It is because of which regulators the pharmaceutical company or biotech have chosen to approach first for the license. And when regulators are given the data, they will be looking essentially at the efficacy of the clinical trial versus the effectiveness of a medicine in everyday medical practice. So in terms of the efficacy, they will be looking at the phase 3 clinical trial that I mentioned earlier. And in that, you'll see that they will have an inclusion criteria that tries to make the patients that take part in the study as homogeneous as possible or as similar as possible. So that may mean that they will say, we only want to study children between 4 and 7 years old with a certain speech ability or a certain cognitive skill. But in reality, once that goes past the clinical trial and it gets prescribed in the real world, it means that you may have children slightly younger with more speech, or you might have some children much older with less speech, and therefore the response and the sort of safety efficacy benefit will be different. And that's why when we look at study designs, understanding the difference between the efficacy as described in the clinical trials or the effectiveness as prescribed in the real world to a different type of population is an important consideration. And that's the difference between what a regulator will do. So the MHRA, the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Authority, or the EMA, the European Medicine Agency, will be looking at that risk-benefit ratio. So is it as safe and effective versus the health technology assessment? So those that need to decide how much to pay will be looking at it in more of a real-world context. So they will, as I say, the regulators will be looking really at both the efficacy and the safety. So what's really important to consider is if your medicine have some beneficial effect, so they may improve cognitive ability, or they may improve speech, or they may improve behavior, but that has to be balanced out with any side effects or safety concern the medicine have. Now, unfortunately, every single medicine will always have some side effects, and those side effects or safety concerns very often can be adjusted according to dose, will sometimes be more prominent in some patients than in others. And what the regulators try and do is they quantify the amount of efficacy seen, so the good response to the medicine versus the possible side effects. And they always have to demonstrate that there is higher clinical benefit. So a good response outweighs any possible side effects or what we call adverse events that are measured in the clinical trial. Whereas, as I say, the reimbursement will be looking at slightly different, is how will it be effective in the real world prescribing? So when we prescribe outside a clinical trial, and most importantly, is it cost effective? Will the healthcare, like the NHS, get value for money in terms of what it produces in the good outcome aspects? And how the regulators and the reimbursement agencies decide that is by collecting lots of data on you as patients and families. And that will sometimes be a mix of clinical outcome assessments and patient-reported outcome, which I'll go into shortly. But I think what's important to remember is the slide I explained previously, where you may have a traditional study design where you will need to go to hospital and have lots of tests, but that's sometimes quite difficult for doctors and the researchers to really understand what happens day to day in your day-to-day life. And did the day that the hospital visit happened to fall on, was it in a good day where your child was feeling really positive and performing well? Or did that hospital appointment happen to be on a really bad day where they were, not really as well as they could have performed? And obviously that can have a huge impact on the outcome of the study because these clinical trials are designed with what we call a primary endpoint in mind. And that's usually a clinical outcome assessment that's measuring how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Now, these can sometimes be biomarkers, so they would be things that you would measure from a blood test or a brain MRI scan. But most notably, the regulators do like some clinical outcomes as well, so not just these biomarkers. And an example that's well known in other diseases is like how long can a child or a patient walk in 6 minutes? And then you'd be sort of looking to see that they could walk further if they've been prescribed the medicine versus patients that have not been prescribed medicine. And that's why during that phase 3 trials, and apologies, I forgot to mention earlier, that we would usually be randomizing patients into having the real treatment or having a placebo. So a placebo is a medicine that will look exactly the same as the real medicine, but it won't actually have any of the um, active substance in it. And patients will be randomly allocated to either have the placebo, and then we'll be comparing how the primary endpoint of assessments work out. I think the thing that's really difficult is that selecting the right primary endpoint, because in most diseases, the manifestation is very heterogeneous. So that means that different patients, different family experience actually quite different symptoms, and therefore trying to find a symptom that is impacting all patients the same and can have a changeable response to the medicine is quite a difficult one. And this is where, if you get the opportunity, I highly recommend and suggest that even if you're not feeling that a clinical trial of a new medicine is the right thing for you, I would really strongly suggest that you work closely with your patient communities to advocate on what are the aspects that are important to you in your day-to-day quality of life, because even if they're not necessarily measured in the clinical trials, the reimbursement agencies will really want to understand this. And these can be conveyed in what we call qualitative research methods. So you may get asked to take part in surveys or interviews or focus groups. And as I say, it's really important that if you can take part in those research, so that the regulators and the reimbursement agents really get to hear your voice of what's important to you on a day-to-day basis. And that's kind of the framework that the regulators now really do want to work on, the measures that matter. So what we look at of how a patient feels and function is really defined from a meaningful aspect of health to patients that's conveyed, which could be communication of needs, wants, and thoughts. That's then conveyed into a concept of interest, such as expressive and receptive communication. And then when it comes to the clinical trial outcome, you could be something like either the number of words that's spoken or ability to interact. And this would be measured via scales, videos, or clinical reviews. Also, there is a growing interest, particularly from the reimbursement agencies. So the people that decide, will they pay for a medicine and how much are they willing to pay? There is a value add or a really important aspect to demonstrate that patients are able to maintain some functional activities in fundamental skills such as eating, dressing, self-care, and how that contributes to not only the patient's quality of life, but to the family's quality of life around them, because they need less support in terms of performing those activities of daily living. I'm not going to play these videos, but I'll obviously share these slides and you can have a look. But this is an example where patients are actually asked to, or families are asked to share their personal testimonials of how their response to treatment were perceived at a FDA. So they're the Food and Drug Administration, so they're the regulatory body in America. And very often, most sponsors of pharmaceuticals will go to the FDA first for a drug approval. And that's this, if by watching this video, you get a strong understanding of why the patient's voice are important in these clinical trials as well. But is taking part in a clinical trial right for you and your family? I really want to emphasize that it has to be a personal choice. There is no right or wrong answer. It just has to be around your personal circumstances. And this is something that you really need to talk about, not only with the doctor, the principal investigator that would be looking after you during that clinical trial, but also your friends and family, because taking part in a clinical trial is a big commitment, and you need to make sure really that everybody around you is able to support you in that. The pros of taking part in a clinical trial is that it means that you might have access to a treatment that is only available as part of that clinical trial. I mentioned that you may end up being prescribed a placebo, but usually even if you're prescribed to placebo at the start of the trial, they would then swap you over and give you the active medicine towards the end. And in some instances, this might be the only way that you have access to that treatment. The new treatment may work better than the standard of care. So in some diseases, there is no kind of effective medicine available for all. There may be some medicines that help with some symptoms, but that this is a way to see if a new treatment could be better than the ones available if they do. Taking part in a clinical trial could help to improve treatments for patients in the future. So even if the clinical trial result is, in that instance, is not positive, it may improve to learnings about what could be better future treatments. For some patients, you may have more blood test scans. Sorry, apologies, that says cancer test. That wouldn't be appropriate in this instance, of course, but you may feel reassured that you're getting more assessments and support. And you would also have more checkups and, have more time with your clinical team. It's not to say that that's for everybody, but some people would find those extra assessments and appointments and support network to be helpful. But there's some potential downside or cons into taking part. There may be some unexpected or serious side effects, which I mentioned. So although there are a lot of testing done, we never really know how individual patients are going to respond to treatments, and especially as we try more innovative treatments. So if you go for treatments like gene therapy, which is really quite new and innovative, we may experience more side effects or different side effects, unexpected side effects than we had previously expected. Even though, as I said, there is a lot of work that's being done to test them beforehand. Other drawbacks might be that you have to do a lot of paperwork. So the informed consent process will be quite long because the principal investigator will really want to make sure that you understand what's involved in taking a clinical trial, taking part in a clinical trial, and they will want you to read quite long documents and sign that you've understood those. As I say, you might have to do more blood tests, more scans, and more tests and assessments. and that may be quite challenging and difficult for you. You may have to travel to hospital a lot more often. And if you're living quite far from that hospital, obviously there's a huge time commitment, resource commitment. And even though you'll be reimbursed for most of your costs, there's a chance that you will be potentially out of pocket just for all the additional expenses for taking part in those. But I just want to emphasize mostly that taking part in a clinical trial is a very personal decision, and what might be right for you may not be right for another family. So I'm just going to swap and play this video because I thought this video was quite a good one to help, and I'm hoping the audio will work, but do let me know if you're not here.
Elin Haf, there is no audio currently, but I think if you share your screen again and select the checkbox for sharing with audio, it might help.
Sorry, I should have checked this before. Maybe, do you mind if I pop it in the chat? And I can't seem to find the, and then maybe I can ask one of you to share if I can't see where the share audio button is. Oh.
So if you click on stop sharing and then repeat the process with sharing, but select pass through system audio.
I think because I've had to join from my web browser, it's not going to work for that option for me at the moment, unfortunately. But I don't know whether somebody...
It's okay. I'll try and share.
Sorry.
No problem. Well, actually, I'm sharing from my browser as well. So let's see if it works. Share audio. Okay. Can you see this okay?
We can see it here.
Diverse representation matters in clinical research studies to understand how potential new drugs might work.
Could you hear as well?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Asian population. But when you hear clinical research study or clinical trial, words like experimental or guinea pig may come to mind. However, that is not how patients are treated in studies. Patients are closely monitored, and their safety is the top priority. We know that unethical and inhumane practices have happened in past research, but thankfully, multiple levels of oversight and protection have been put in place to make sure that patients are safe from foreseeable harm. As part of a study, doctors follow a protocol, which is the manual to do the study. The protocol is approved and overseen by many experts to be sure it is followed exactly as described. The study protocol goes beyond general care, and your healthcare team always ensures your medical needs are met. Yet you may still be asking, what's in it for me? For George, it provided a level of care that he had never had before. It meant he was able to spend more time with his healthcare team and get all of his questions answered. For Lupe, a working mom concerned about out-of-pocket costs for travel and childcare while at the study clinic, she was able to consider participating because her costs were reimbursed by the site. The study gave hope to Fred. He joined because his medicines were not working as well as he wanted. Although there wasn't a guarantee that the new study would work for him, it was an option that he wanted to try. And for Jasmine, she joined the study for her daughter and granddaughter. She wants there to be a potential treatment for her and her family. Ask your doctor questions so you can make an informed decision. There are many reasons why a study may or may not be right for you. Talk about options with your doctor and your family. You decide what is right for you. To see more questions, visit the clinicaltrials.gov site. For more information on clinical research studies, see this video. What is a clinical research study, in English or Spanish?
Thank you for playing that. So that was the end of my presentation, but I'm very happy to answer any questions or clarifications that anybody may have.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions, and I think when we run out of the ones submitted to Q&A, we'll just enable the microphone, so folks are be prepared to raise your hand. We'll process you in the first come, first served order. So just to get us started, you mentioned reimbursement agencies. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about those? Is there just one in the UK? Is it NICE, or is it completely different agency?
So it is a bit complicated in the UK, and the fact that yes, NICE is the one would be responsible for very highly specialized one, so quite expensive one. But even based on NICE's decision, then every devolved country will then have their own review. So NHS England will look at the recommendation from NICE in the same way as NHS Scotland or NHS Wales will look at them. But there's no guarantee that NHS Wales would fund it, even though NHS England would. This is mainly when the cost of the treatment is really expensive, however.
Thank you. That is very interesting and convoluted, as expected. So you also mentioned the costs and benefits analysis. Is it a pharma company that runs the trial? Is it their responsibility to evaluate the benefit, or is it done by an independent body?
Yeah, so the pharmaceutical company will gather all the data. So they have an obligation that they will have to report all the data. So the efficacy endpoint, but also any safety. And they have to give all the data to the regulators, so to the MHRA, to the European Medicine Agency, or to the FDA. And then the regulators will be re-evaluating what the pharma company have submitted to them to make sure that they actually agree with how the data is being summarized and analyzed and presented.
And in terms of benefit that is measured as a cost savings to the health system, is that reevaluated by a regulator, or is that taken from like the granted one?
No, so a regulator will never make a decision about the cost. They will just make a decision about whether it's safe and effective. It will always then be a health technology assessment like NICE in the UK that make a decision of whether they want to pay for it and how much they pay for it. And that's something that they will negotiate at sort of an individual level. So it's not necessarily that every country will pay the same amount of money for the same medicine. The important thing to consider is that the reimbursement agencies like NICE, they may require more data to demonstrate the cost effectiveness. So maybe things like what we call caregiver burden questionnaires. So they may ask you to complete additional surveys that describe how many hours a day do you have to spend looking after your loved one, or did you have to reduce your work hours to care, so that they get an insight of the economic impact for you as a family to see whether, if the medicine was prescribed and the patient was able to go to school independently and go on to work independently, what the economic value of that would be.
Great, thank you. Now we'll go to Domingo's question. From your experience, how much difference do you usually find in the effectiveness of a medication during and after the trial?
So this can be quite significant. It depends a lot on the disease. So as an example, if you find in a clinical trial that they measured the medicine in, say, mild young patients, and then once it becomes on the market, your doctor will try and prescribe it to much older, severe patients, then you may not get the same effect that you saw in the clinical trial. And so that's then why you're not always guaranteed to get the same response. but also in a clinical trial, we aggregate all the patient results together. And even then, some patients will respond to it better than the other, or some patient may be more sensitive to side effects. So it is relatively common, but your doctor will work with you to see if you need some individual dose adjustment or additional medicine to support it.
Great, thank you. I think now we're ready to move on to the questions from, well, asked via people asking them verbally. If I could ask everyone who wants to ask a question to use the raise your hand functionality so that we have an orderly queue or a chance at one. So I'm gonna allow the microphone for all attendees. At a risk, I might have to start doing forced mutes, but please raise your hand and ask a question.
If there are no questions, I'm also obviously very happy to share my email address, and if anybody wants to follow up with me.
Yeah, we have one from Stefan.
Yeah, hi, this is Stefan. So I'm conscious that gene therapy, generally speaking, is, to my understanding, quite new. And therefore, from a clinical trial perspective, I mean, if you, are there things which, permanently affect a person's genome, or is that still sort of cutting edge? I mean, just where are we kind of on the spectrum of that being possible?
So when you have a gene therapy, the critical thing to look at is the vector. So the vector is sort of the transporter, the sort of virus that will carry the gene into the body. Now, for gene therapy to work is that you need to know that it's one single gene and what that genotype is. And that's not always possible in all diseases because we don't know enough about the sort of single gene genotype for different diseases. But the good thing is that we can learn from other vectors, from the vectors that have been used, and some vectors are better at targeting disease that impact the liver, or vectors that are better at targeting the brain. And we can learn from those studies. So even if they're in different diseases, we learn and can apply those to future ones. And so every time that reduces the risks for the overall gene therapy approach, but of course that the individual gene would need to be specific.
Yeah, just to add on that, Elin Haf, because Angelman syndrome is a one gene disorder, so we kind of expect that we know that it can be targeted by gene therapy. I have a question, if nobody else has a question, around placebo. So it's, I think for us at the moment, we have a couple of clinical trials available, but they're all quite intense in terms of the participation from the families. What are the benefits for families if there is a phase 3 trial with a placebo? What are the benefits for families and patients to participate in it if there is a high chance that it will be placebo?
Yeah, so depending, I mentioned briefly the randomization. So because they want to have a group that's as comparable as possible, they randomly allocate. Usually it's 50-50, although it sometimes can be 2-1. So you'll have a higher number that gets given the medicine than the placebo. So when you talk about it with your doctor, you should ask what the randomization is. So is there more having active treatments versus placebo? Some of the benefits of taking part in a clinical trial is that you will actually, and for whatever, I'm not saying it's always right, but you will probably get better care. So you will have more speech and language therapists spend time with you. You will have more physiotherapists spend time with you and give some suggestions of how to manage things. And that's actually called the placebo effect, because you end up getting better care and sort of knowledge and stuff around. The downside of that, of course, is, like I said, a lot of hospital visits, a lot of assessments, and that might be difficult for you to balance with your individual personal family circumstances. So I think, sadly, the honest truth is there may not be absolute guarantee of any benefit for you, but if you are randomized to placebo control, most studies will then, at the end of that phase 3, swap all of you onto the active treatment. So you would get it at the end of the phase 3 in a roll-on study, and that's something that you should talk about. Interestingly, when I supported families in clinical trials before, some were like kind of going, well, actually, I'm quite happy to be on placebo because, you know, if there are side effects, it may mean my child's not the one that gets the side effect and will still learn about it, or that kind of thing. So it depends, you know, if you're kind of more risk averse, then the placebo might work well for you too.
Thank you.
We have
Yeah.
one more question from Jana and Donna.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you.
Two questions. One is, I'm just wondering why you're starting to have these webinars. Is it because we are going to start seeing more trials in the UK, and you're preparing the parents for, you know, how to access them? That's number one. What's number two?
I can take that one. So we do have currently 2 clinical trials that we run in London and in Oxford with our 2 sites, and we can share more details separately. And we do try and share it on all platforms across social media. We do expect that there will be more clinical trials. We know kind of the pipeline based on the latest kind of Science Summit. If you haven't checked it out, there was a FAST Science Summit early this month. Based on the pipeline, we do expect to see more clinical trials in the next couple of years, and therefore, yeah, we do want families to be prepared for this, because as we kind of gathered today, it's a really difficult decision, and so many things to be considered. Yeah.
Okay, the second one is to do a bit more scientific. We were just wondering, since Angelman is the maternal gene, there are, we've talked to other parents with children with Angelman, and even though it's one gene, there are other deletions and around it, and there are other complications around it. So it doesn't seem as simple as just turning the gene back on. Is that something that is sort of universal within Angelman and completely accepted by the medical and scientific community?
I guess my experience is not in genetics and in the genotype well enough, I'm afraid. So I don't think I'm well placed enough to answer sort of the Angelman genetic questions specifically, I'm afraid. But I'm sure, Irina, we can kind of
I can chip in here very, very quickly, if that's a benefit. So all of the trials that are active globally have an exclusion and inclusion criteria, and all of them include deletions. Some of them include mutations, and some of them, one specifically, includes UPD. We anticipate that this trend will likely to continue until there is a confidence amongst pharma companies that they can certainly address the deletions population, because it's the most prevalent one, and that will give them the extra wind to their sail to add minority genotypes. So
Thank you.
it's definitely understood by farmers and everyone involved that there are different genotypes, and they're certainly looking at both the cost and risk in terms of including the minority population.
Thank you.
So I think there was a question more from the perspective that there are other genes involved, not just the UB3, right? Janice, that was your question?
Yes.
Or,
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that is widely understood by the scientific community. However, I think from understanding generally is that if the UB3 gene is fixed, then it provides the most benefits, and therefore this is the key focus. But there is that understanding, and I think scientists are looking into
there is
other
one
genes
extra trial that launched recently by Roche and Elegabat, and it specifically addresses the GABA deficiency. So in addition to UB3, an important cluster of genes and deletions is addressed. is impacted in deletion. So that trial specifically addresses the downstream impacts from the missing GABA genes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think Bharath, you're next, please.
Thanks. Is there any minimum age restriction to start the trial, or?
I think you're asking about minimum age. I think overall, this is defined within your inclusion criteria based on what the sponsor wants. So the regulators tend to be a little bit nervous about starting in very young children before gathering some data and experience in older children. But we also do know that, particularly with gene therapy and other diseases, that to see the real benefit, you need to treat as young as possible. And so it will be defined on a study-by-study basis based on the inclusion criteria. And that's usually with the pharmaceutical company and the regulators discussing the value add of going as young as possible versus the safety of knowing as much as possible about the treatment before going to the very young.
Where can we register for these trials? Is there any site where we can register it?
So I think, Irina, you mentioned there are 2 clinical trials in the UK recruiting.
Yes.
So I guess it would be to try and find out what the inclusion criteria for those studies are and whether your child would be eligible for the time being, I think, if I heard the question correctly.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, they can be all checked on the clinicaltrials.gov.uk, and we can put a link on that in chat as well.
So after 18 years old, if for adults and children under 18 or that there is a process of what we call assent, so children would be expected to provide assent. For people living with a disease over 18 that don't have necessarily cognitive function to really understand, then they would be expected for the next of kin to take on the consent process, even if that individual is over 18.
Can I ask a quick one as well, Elin Haf, one around the endpoints? So I think when we were talking about the endpoints, we, as a community, and I think as an Angelman syndrome impact it has on people, it's for us, it may be not clinically important for pharma companies or the MHRA when they look into it. But for us, even if a child says, I don't know, 1, 2 words, right? It may be very important for us as parents. What can we do to make sure that our kind of voice is heard as parents and community in this aspect? Is there anything that you've seen from the past that works?
Yeah, definitely. I really highly advocate as a community that you're really already start looking at evidence generation yourselves of what are important. So that could be that as a community that you start running surveys, doing qualitative interviews, and you can reach to either academic partners or you can do it internally. So we sort of work with Duchenne UK as an example on our patient group accelerator, where we work with patients and families for them to decide on what's a meaningful change to them. And even if it's not necessarily included in the clinical trials, it is so important to gather that information early on, because if you get a license for it, if the regulators grant a license for it, you still need to persuade the reimbursement agency that it's worth paying for. And this is actually a really tough step, because what the reimbursement agency may feel is important, may be quite different to what you and families. So any activities that you can start on that sort of looks at that, because also I would strongly advocate all the different countries have very different standard of care for different disorders. So I would highly advocate that in the UK, relative to what you have in terms of physio support, school support, or whatever, you know, try and identify what's important to you that should be considered by the reimbursement and or regulators for measuring meaningful change.
Thank you. That's useful. And I think that should be the focus for us as an organization as well as community. Thank you. I guess if no more questions, any final call for questions anyone wants to raise? All right, as we just have a couple of minutes, so I think Dr. Davies, as you suggested, if you share your email, then we can, if anyone wants to reach out, ask a specific question, would really appreciate it. But just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and of course, thank you, Dr. Davies, to yourself, and for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very useful, and we hope everyone found it useful, and we are looking forward to welcoming you to other events in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
That's great.
Thank you.